You may be familiar with this dark, sinister, mysterious figure known as Baphomet. Nowadays, this evil figure is often associated with Satanism or the occult. Most often, it is actually used by deliberately provocative atheist people or movements which sarcastically call themselves Satanist. More to that later. The truth about this figure, however, is much more interesting and surprising than most people think. It goes back to Islam. Yes, really. The first written record of the name Baphomet goes back to the First Crusade in the 11th century and is found in a letter by the Crusader Anselm of Ribemont, Count of Ostravant and the Valenciennes, who wrote down his observations of the siege of Antioch in 1098, where the Crusaders and the Byzantine Empire fought together against the Muslim Seljuk Turks. Anselm himself died in battle in 1099. The quote found in his letter goes as follows. As the next day dawned, they called loudly upon Baphomet, and we prayed silently in our hearts to God. Then we attacked and forced all of them outside the city walls. So the first written record of Baphomet directly attributes the worship of Baphomet to none other than Muslims. The problem is that Muslims do not worship a figure named Baphomet, supposedly. The common theory, which can also be easily figured out, is that the Muslims were invoking Muhammad, which Anselm heard or for some reason reported as Baphomet. This can be further understood when we analyze how Western European Christian speakers pronounced the name of Muhammad at that time. Western Europe was unfamiliar with what Muslims are and what they worship. Works covering this were very few. Muslims were very often referred to as Hagarites due to their claim to descend from Ishmael through Hagar, or as Ishmaelites, or as Saracens. Saracen has a very complex and less clear origin story which deserves its own extensive analysis. Specifically, when dealing with the Turkic Muslims like the Seljuks, which they were fighting, the term Turks was common. Western knowledge of Muslims and Muhammad came mainly through the Byzantine Empire, but also partly through reports about the Muslim rulers of Spain or Iberia. By the 8th century, the name Muhammad was Latinized as Mahometus. This character was known as the false prophet, or false idol, or false god that the pagan Muslims worship, who presumed to speak in the name of God. In the oldest surviving great French work of literature, the 11th century Song of Roland, Muslims are described as pagans who worship their idols, primarily Mahomet. Now, Christianity is a complete faith which has no need for an expectation for another prophet or another revelation. So Islam was seen simply as a hostile force that is the work of the devil against the truth, a hostile, demonic, pagan religion. The fact that Muslims were brutally hostile invaders didn't help, of course. So Mahomet was the common way to refer to Muhammad. It gets kind of complicated after this, but the general idea is that some people like Anselm and others who spoke Old French substituted the sounds or misheard the Muslims and interpreted Muhammad or Mahomet as Baphomet. So a Western Christian Old French speaker who already believed that the Muslims worshipped the false idol Mahomet could have potentially remembered the name as Baphomet instead. Think of a crusader who knows more about his faith and his duties than about whatever these pagan invaders believe in. He hears people invoke Muhammad in a language that he doesn't understand, and he hears it as Baphomet, and this becomes popular. Anselm is not the only example. The name Baphomet for Muhammad also appears in other available texts from the 12th and 13th centuries. The general use of this term was rare, but not entirely uncommon, until the 14th century, when King Philip IV of France needed good reasons to persecute and exterminate the most famous Crusader order, the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were founded officially as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, around the year 1119 for the First Crusade, to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land from Muslims. It was a monastic order whose members made vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and military prowess. The Knights Templar were powerful and revolutionary. One of their main contributions were that they established a banking system. for travelers and pilgrims who were afraid of being robbed on their way to the Holy Land. The Knights Templar would take money from Christians who took off from Europe. They would write down the amount of money that the traveler deposited, and would give them a code that only other Knights Templar in the Holy Land could read. Once the Christian traveler arrived in the Holy Land, he could give the code to the people, to the Knights Templar in charge, and withdraw the very same amount that he deposited back in Europe. A very effective way for pilgrims and travelers to use their finances in the Holy Land without risking getting robbed on the way. The problem is that many people who used this banking system died on their travels or during the Crusades, and the money they deposited was either given to their families or in many instances simply left with the Knights Templar, who then used the money for charity and the church. When the Third and Fourth Crusades failed, however, the fourth with major financial struggles and Crusader bankruptcy, many rulers and fighters wanted to find someone to blame for it all, and given that the Knights Templar were so famous and had amassed so much wealth, primarily for the Crusades and the safeguarding of Christianity and Christians in the Holy Land, they became a perfect target for scapegoating. It didn't help that they also extended their banking system to merchants, nobility, and monarchs, and that they began giving loans to rulers like the King of France, to later be collected. The French king was dealing with major economic struggles and owed lots of money to the Knights Templar. And what better way to deal with such struggles than to hit two birds with one stone? He could distract the population by creating an evil enemy within and accusing them of being a cult that secretly conspires against the population. He could also refuse to pay back his debt and ideally erase the debt and plunder whatever the Knights Templar had in their possession. King Philip wanted to establish power, distract from struggles, but he also really wanted to take the wealth of the Knights Templar. So he started a campaign accusing the Knights Templar of having become a secretive cult that had abandoned Christianity and was involved in major conspiracies and perverted sexual and demonic practices. A very sinister move. Under his leadership, the Knights Templar were also accused of having adopted the ways and beliefs of the Muslims with whom they had interacted for far too long. Now, historically, none of this is in any way supported. There is no single shred of evidence that the Knights Templar did any of these things that they were accused of. By all accounts, they were devout Christians at the service of Christianity and God until the very end. Philip IV issued a mass arrest of the Knights Templar and began their torture under bogus charges of denial of Christ, spitting and urinating on the cross, sexual initiation rites, sodomy, idolatry, and so on. Pope Clement V didn't approve any of this and was outraged. He demanded the release of the Knights Templar at first, but King Philip IV began pressuring and threatening the Pope himself, until the Pope eventually complied and allowed the proceedings to happen. During these trials of the Crusaders, the name Baphomet arose once again. Under brutal torture, multiple Knights Templar gave in and admitted to desecrating the cross, engaging in sex rituals, and worshipping Baphomet among other idols. It is unclear how and when exactly Baphomet arose during these trials, but given the context, it can be understood that what they were actually accused of in this case was to have become Muslims, worshipping the Muslim god or the Muslim idol. The funny thing is that their description of Baphomet as an idol was completely contradictory. Some of them described Baphomet as a severed human head, others as a bearded male head, some as a wooden head, others again as a multi-faced monstrous figure. They also described that they would kiss this figure and do other things before it. The idea here is that Baphomet is the idol that Muslims worship, as we established earlier. Now, as said, the idea here is that Baphomet was adopted from the Muslims, but the fact that Muslims don't actually worship this idol shows that these admissions were clearly nonsensical. The Knights Templar simply admitted to false crimes which would satisfy their torture in order to put an end to the unbearable torture. Once the torture ended, the Knights Templar renounced these false admissions and confessed that they were given under torture. It is quite clear that they were telling the truth. but it was already too late at this point. The French king and his authorities accepted the renounced contradictory nonsensical admissions given under torture as admissions of their guilt, and used this as proof that these people are actually in a secret evil cult. As a result, the Knights Templar were collectively executed and the order was disbanded. Their possessions in France were mostly seized by the king, and his debts were successfully erased. In other parts outside France, their belongings were transferred to other orders like the Knights Hospitalier. One legendary story says that the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, who was a devout Christian, spoke to the crowd as he was being executed. He wanted to be turned toward the Notre Dame. He was very firm. He faced the Notre Dame and prayed, and then loudly said as he was being burned at the stake, "Pope Clement, King Philip, before this year is out, I summon you to appear before the tribunal of God to answer for your crimes." His words come from legendary accounts, but the fact is that Pope Clement V died only a month later from illness, while King Philip IV died about 8 months later in a hunting accident within the same year. This is actually a historical fact. This episode triggered major conspiracy theories, of course, such as that the Knights Templar were behind major conspiracies and that they were somehow still alive. They weren't fully eradicated. They went underground and transformed into other secret societies where they still secretly run things and pull all the strings. Some of those conspiracy theories persist to this day. After this, Baphomet became a legendary evil folklore figure that the general population didn't know much about. Discussions about Baphomet were very rare among scholars. Very few sources discussed Baphomet as a demonic figure, as a Gnostic figure, or simply as a historical reference regarding the Knights Templar. Only in 1818 did Baphomet once again arise as a significant figure in the writings of one Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, who treated Baphomet as an actual hermaphroditic Gnostic idol that represented secret heretical wisdom. He interpreted the history of the Knights Templar and wrote a pseudo-historical account where the Knights Templar were an allegedly heretical Gnostic cult of proto-Freemasons who worship Baphomet literally or symbolically as a hidden, dualistic emblem of forbidden knowledge. Based on this, in 1856, Baphomet was first depicted in this notorious form that is nowadays familiar. Eliphas Levi, who was a French occultist, adopted the ideas of Joseph and depicted Baphomet as a sabbatic goat, a winged hermaphroditic humanoid with a goat head, a torch between its horns, and esoteric symbols. He probably unintentionally associated a goat with Islam. Levi used Baphomet as a positive figure for his heretical Christian dualistic Gnostic views, in which Baphomet symbolized true secret knowledge, pure symbolism, and the perfect harmony of opposites in the world. He actually thought the Templars had discovered and achieved the true esoteric understanding of revelation and God, and that they were killed because Christians at that time did not understand them. This was, of course, complete nonsense. It was the occultist Aleister Crowley who in the early 20th century adopted Baphomet as his own identity and as a proper symbol of his even deeper understanding of the world, of magic, and of human nature. To him, Baphomet embodied arcane perfection, an absolute equilibrium representing the synthesis of opposites, such as male and female, human and animal, light and darkness, creation, destruction, good and evil, into one unified, divine, whole being, the bisexual, androgynous original being. Only when one achieves this perfect balance has one acquired perfection. That was in essence his philosophy. Then came the greatest idiots of our time, the Church of Satan, led by Anton LaVey. Based on this evolution of Baphomet and its association with Gnosticism, but mostly because it was just a forbidden symbol, Anton LaVey adopted Baphomet and created the so-called sigil of Baphomet as an anti-religious and anti-dogmatic symbol. LaVey and the so-called Church of Satan did not actually believe in the existence of God or Satan or demons. LaVey himself was an atheist. To him it was only a provocative symbol for the Satanist philosophy of complete freedom, embrace of what is forbidden, and the rejection of religion. also known as pure degeneracy. Of course, you could argue that while rejecting the existence of Satan, the Satanists engaged and engage in exactly what people expect from actual Satanists. Way to make the point. Because Satanists use this symbol, the public began to increasingly associate this figure with Satanism, with Satan and demons. This is how today, despite being based on a misunderstanding and on esoteric symbolism, Baphomet became the symbol for the devil and for evil. Yet when you go back to its origins, Baphomet is simply another name for none other than Muhammad. And to be honest, I think that's perfectly befitting. In the beginning, Baphomet was what people associated with the evil force, Islam, that brutally assaults and invades Christian lands and prevents fellow Christians from going to the Holy Land. An evil that declares war on everything that you hold sacred. An evil that terrorizes innocent people and attempts to destroy what is holy. It is almost poetic that today it stands for the demonic, for Satan, the same evil force. But it goes full circle and is, in the end, all about Muhammad again. So how about we start a new trend and refer to Muhammad as Baphomet again, for whom it was originally used. So let's say Baphomet is Muhammad, or even better, Muhammad is Baphomet. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and to hit the like button. And if you want to support my work, since I'm finally back making videos, also consider subscribing and supporting my work on apostateprofit.com/donate. We are restarting this, and I'm very happy to do it. Let's do this together. I'll be back very soon. Have a fantastic day, and as always, stay away from Islam.